Good evening, class. I'm excited to come to you with my composer tonight. I chose Richard Wagner, and if anybody would have told us we'd be doing this virtually through video, I'd been like, you guys are crazy, but here we are. So without further ado, let's get started. So Richard Wagner begins, let's begin with a quote. It says, "Music begins where words end." His early life and career. He was a 17th century composer and emphasized music as the driving force of the drama. He was born in Leipzig, Germany in 1813 with a deep interest in theater and music. He also wrote music and operas by the age of 20. Also, he was very influenced by his father, who was an actor, poet, and painter. More about his early life and his career. He married Mina Planer in 1836 and spent his early years of marriage unhappy because of his inability to have his works performed by others. He continued to write during this time a few works: A Pilgrimage to Beethoven, A Happy Ending, and End in Paris. These pieces grew in importance throughout time and were later found by pieces of his diary. Continuing his early life and career, in 1842, Wagner was able to get two of his operas performed, Renzi and Der Fliegenden Hooligan. I'm sure I butchered the German there. This led him to begin appointed second Kapellmeister of the King of Saxony and Der Stend, and he directed operas and conducted the orchestra. Wagner also had to flee. He fled to Switzerland due to the insurrection. He wrote Das Heimgold during this time, an opera influenced by his own financial hardship. Once he was introduced to King Louis II, who was a huge fan, was basically like a patron to him, and which this allotted him the financial stability to begin his work on his operas known as the Ring Cycle. Moving forward into his professional life. His professional life was soaring, but his personal life was a complete mess. He had 3 children out of wedlock, and he found himself in many love connections and affairs. The affairs were inspired. They actually inspired him to write Tristan und Isolde, which was an opera that described turmoil, pain, and love affairs that caused lives of all involved. Some of his major works were Die Meister von Nürnberg and Das Rheingold, Die Werk, Schören and Gortenen, and these make up the Ring Cycle. And later on we will hear some examples of those. So moving forward into more of his major works, on the next slide it describes what Das Rheingold. It was a prelude to Der Ring Nürnberg, and it inspired Wagner's financial troubles. It was written around the gold ring that gives its owner power for love, but exchanges multiple hands throughout the opera. It shows how difficult it was for Wagner to get his big break and become financially secure. Parsifal is showcased by Wagner's inability to suggest ideas, stories, and characters together as one unfulfilled work, written to the reclamation by the Knights of the Holy Grail that spiked the impaled Christ's side of his crucifixion. Next, one of his major works is Tristan und Isolde, which I'm sure we all remember from our listening example in class. Based on Gottfried von Strassenberg's romance, it had many drafts and revisions. It wasn't finished until 1859. The opera was ahead of its time due to the sheer complexity of the musical arrangement. It was finally performed in Munich on June 10, 1865. Difficult for audience members to understand, most important and influential operas ever composed. Its complexity. Wagner wrote his Forbidden Lover after the prelude, which was performed in Paris with strings. He quotes, "It was as though the scales had fallen from my eyes, allowing me to see immeasurably I have traveled from the world during the last 8 years. We will talk about his leitmotifs, and there's also a video later on in the presentation that goes into great detail on his leitmotifs. So moving on to the next slide, we have leitmotifs. They're individual characters themselves that had unique leitmotifs. They're loud, demanding urgency and fear, to the softness and hope and gentle love. The orchestra played in specific ways for each character as well. The Tristan chord, first known to the audience, hears for the first time, which is F, D, F, B, D sharp, and G sharp. Vocalists. So everybody knows that Wagner required more from a vocalist than any other composer had at this time. We hear things of the Helden tenor, which is a dramatic sounding tenor with a very big, robust sound, to sing roles that required a very penetrating, a very nice cut through the orchestra so they could be heard among all of the parts going on. These unique voices were able to be shown through the sound, like we just said, but they didn't have the dramatic effect of the actual attending the opera. Continuing on to the next slide is a video of Tristan und Isolde. Really listen to how the soprano sounds through this. So you might have heard how the orchestra and the soprano voice had a very, very nice balance between the two. You could very strongly hear the orchestra, but you could also very strongly hear the soprano singing. She would also be known as a Wagnerian soprano, which has a powerful, rich texture in her voice, and she can sing through the full orchestra just like a Helden tenor could. A Wagnerian soprano also has a darker timbre to her voice. If we go to the next slide, I believe it's on there. And it often, they were used for a heroic, suffering or tragic women of the opera, a role that they would play. Their vocal range is typically from A to a high C, and we will listen to a video of a Wagnerian soprano now. So a lovely, lovely, rich tone to the Wagnerian soprano. And I would encourage you to go back to this and listen to these and really get this down in your head. And probably my favorite part of any part of the presentation is the Wagnerian tuba, and that is on the next slide. And it is also referred to as the Wagner horns, or the Tuben in German, and created for the ring cycle. They have rotary valves which are played with the left hand, and these are super interesting and just such a great cool, unique sound. So we also have a video of that. And as this video plays, this is also a great educational video, and it also goes into more detail about leitmotifs and such.
A leitmotif simply is a theme that's assigned to a character or an emotion or sometimes even an object throughout the ring cycle. And Wagner's use of thematic material isn't really unique because composers do that all the time. What is unique is the development of them.
Okay, well, thank you guys so much for listening to my presentation of Richard Wagner. There's some really cool stuff in those videos that I don't think we would have time to listen to for the whole presentation. We got to give everybody else time to get their presentation in too. And Mr. Davis, you probably don't want to sit here and listen to everybody's videos because you have so many of us to grade. But I thank everyone for listening, and I hope you guys enjoyed and have a good luck on your finals. Thanks, everybody.